Hello everyone, my name is Yosef Abu Hassan, and today I'll be presenting to you my PowerPoint on cognitive psychology. All right, so cognition. We make choices every day. Ever wonder how we make them? A healthy/efficient cognitive skill is dependent on three things. One, the ability to detect the stimulus via our sensory organs, eyes, ears, nose, tongue, and skin. This is called receiving. The ability for our brain to work harmoniously with its many parts to form patterns that processes the sensory input. This is called processing. And then we have the ability to send the correct output signal to react to the information that has been received from and processed. This is called responding. All right? So, we've learned about this black box in class. This black box is basically your processing center, your brain. So you have the input, which is the stimulus, this gray arrow. The stimulus enters the black box, your brain. It processes the information and then acts upon it, called the response, or the output, or the red arrow. Okay? Next, we have the science of the mind. What is cognitive psychology and how is it important? It is the study of how people remember, pay attention, and think. Most of what we do, say, and feel is guided by things we already know. How do we measure/study this? By understanding what cognitive neuroscience is, and by using clinical neuropsychology, and by utilizing neuroimaging techniques, we are able to measure cognition. All right? These processes and studies will be discussed further as we go along the PowerPoint. Next. Cognitive psych and its impact. Cognitive psychology emerged in the 1950s, and its powerful impact on the wider field of psychology has led academics to speak of this as the cognitive revolution. A predecessor of cognitive psychology was introspection. Introspection is a big word. It means the process through which one looks within to observe and record the content of one's own mental life. There are limitations to introspection, however, such as one cannot inform us about the unconscious mental events, and even with conscious events, claims rooted in introspection are often untestable. There is no way for an independent observer to check the accuracy or completeness of an introspection report. It is fair to say that introspection reports are unique to the individual, and that's why it is limited, because you can't test things that are going on in other people's brains. You can't check for validity, you can't check for accuracy, you can't even know it's real or not. You can't, okay? Next, behavioralist and transcendental methods. It is defined as the study to have behavior changes in response to different configurations of stimuli. Rejected introspection. All right, so this theory rejected introspection, stating that only mechanisms and behaviors are open and readily observable. So whereas introspection was trying to validate things that were going on in your head, behaviorists and transcendental methods came in and said, look, no, this isn't going to work. Only mechanisms and behaviors that are open and readily observable are things that we can measure. These are concrete, okay? However, even with this movement, there were limitations. So limitations to behaviorist movements: perception and understanding, influences, overthinking behavior, and feelings. To make the best of both worlds, psychologists have turned to the transcendental method, which is a method in which one focuses on observable events that are busy, but then asks what invisible events mess up taking place in order to take place to make the visible effects possible. Theorists and their contributions to the emergence of cognitive psychology. Tolman's research demonstrated that even in rats, learning involved acquisition of new knowledge and not just a change in behavior. Chomsky argued that behavioral analysis was inadequate for learning language use. Gestalt psychologists emphasized the role of perception in organizing experiences. Bartlett's research showed that people spontaneously fit their experiences into a mental framework or schema. All right? Next, we have cognitive psychologists. So a little bit of an overview about cognitive psychologists. They borrowed ideas from computers, including early work on artificial intelligence. They rely on a diverse set of methods. They rely on collection of data and measurement, quality of performance, response speed, which allows for methods to probe underlying biology of phenomena. Ways to measure: there is the neuroimaging techniques. There is the MRI, which shows in detail images of the brain. There is the fMRI, which records the measure of blood and tissue spatially, so where things are happening. However, it is not good at when things are happening. The TMS uses magnetic waves to have imaging of certain parts of the brain shut down so that you can see activations in other parts of the brain. The neural basis of cognition. Where does cognition take place? You guessed it, the brain. The brain is made up of three main parts: the forebrain, the midbrain, and the hindbrain. Think of them as scoops of ice cream. So the hindbrain's the first scoop, the midbrain's the second scoop, and the forebrain's the last scoop, each scoop being bigger than the other, all right? Within these parts, the brain is separated into different sections. So you have the frontal, temporal, parietal, and occipital lobes that make up the brain. Each lobe has its own main job. The frontal lobe is responsible for decision-making and other executive functions. The temporal lobe is responsible for awareness and audio processing. The parietal lobe is responsible for assembling sensory information from other parts of the brain into a form that you can comprehend and use. How do these all work together? There is something called contralateral control, which means that the left side of the brain controls the right side of the brain, and the right side of the brain controls the left side of the brain in harmony for everything to function as one. All right? So next, we're going to talk about the nervous systems. Okay? So, the nervous systems. We have two separate parts. We have the CNS, or the central nervous system, and we have the peripheral nervous system. As you can see with the photo on the right, the central nervous system is made up of the brain and the spinal cord. The peripheral nervous system consists of the nerves and ganglia that extend from the central nervous system. All right? The peripheral nervous system is further split into two groups. There is the autonomic and somatic nervous system. The autonomic nervous system controls involuntary movements, whereas the somatic nervous system controls the muscle movement and relays info from the sensory organs to the central nervous system. Next, we're going to be talking about neurotransmitters. Okay? So, neurons send electrical signals within themselves. However, between other neurons, they send chemical signals. These chemical signals are called neurotransmitters. In more detail, a neurotransmitter that is released at the end of a nerve fiber by the arrival of a nerve impulse and by diffusing across the synapse or junction. So at the end of the neuron signal, between a neuron and another neuron, it will release a neurotransmitter which contains the signal, the chemical signal, all right, to another neuron, which will attach onto the synapse of another neuron at its own little like docking station or base, okay? Some neurotransmitters and their functions, we're not going to go over all of them, but they are right here if you need a reference. So the top three that stick out for me are dopamine, all right? We're all familiar with this one. Its function is to influence movement, learning, attention, and emotion. Excess dopamine receptor activity is linked to schizophrenia. And when you don't have enough dopamine, the brain produces the tremors and decreased mobility as those seen in Parkinson's disease. All right, we have serotonin, which affects mood, hunger, sleep, and arousal. All right, so an undersupply is linked to depression. Prozac and some other antidepressant drugs raise serotonin levels, all right? And norepinephrine, which helps control alertness and arousal as well. And an undersupply of it can cause a depression and mood, okay? So next we will be talking about common diseases of the brain. So some common diseases of the brain, we're going to talk about lesions, which are damaged areas in the brain, okay? And how specific lesions in certain parts of the brain and certain lobes affect certain things within you, all right? So apraxia, it's a lesion in the frontal lobe that causes the loss of the ability to control voluntary action, okay? Agnosias is a lesion in the occipital lobe that causes the ability, the loss of the ability to identify familiar objects. You have, again, the unilateral neglect system, which is inherent in its name, a lesion in the parietal lobe, which causes the loss of ability to, you guessed it, not see half of the world, okay? So unilateral neglect system, loss of the ability to see half of the visual world. Aphasia is a lesion in the groove between the frontal and parietal lobe that leads to a disruption in language capacities, all right? Capgras syndrome, this is one of the first ones that we learned, is imposter syndrome, all right? There's a delusion that makes familiar people unrecognizable, okay? Next, we have the visual system. What is it and how does it work? The visual system is made up of photoreceptors in which light is produced and reflected. It passes through the cornea and the lens. These lenses focus the incoming light by tightening or relaxing and then processes the information to the retina. There are rods and cones. These are different kinds of cells in your eye. The rods are used in low light situations, which is called scotopic vision, and there are more in number than cones, all right? Cones are used in light situations, which are called photopic, and help you perceive fine details. These fine details, the perception of the fine details is called acuity, and it does this by centering the objects into the fovea, which is a part of your eye. Next, we will be talking about the features of the visual system. So, within the visual system, there is lateral inhibition. Rods and cones do not report directly to the cortex. Instead, they send information to bipolar cells, and then those excite ganglion cells, which in turn form a bundle of fibers called the optic fiber. Okay? There is a tract that leaves the eyeball and carries information into a location into the thalamus called the lateral geniculate nucleus. Okay? From there, information is transmitted to the primary projection area for vision in the occipital lobe. Edge enhancement is a feature that highlights information about an object's shape. All right? Next, we will be talking about visual coding. What is the code through which neurons manage to represent the shapes, colors, sizes, and movements that you perceive? Signal neurons and single-cell recording. This is a procedure through which investigators can record moment by moment the pattern of electrical changes within a single neuron. Lots of what we know about the visual system is based on the work done by David Hubel and Torsten Wiesel. They discovered the centers around cells. All right. Next, we will be talking about visual maps and firing synchrony. So, a feature of the visual map and firing synchrony is parallel processing. What is it? Parallel processing is a what and where system. The what system is located in the inferotemporal cortex and the occipital lobe, whereas the where system is located in the posterior parietal and is then a separate lobe. And information on the right is perceived by the left, and information on the left is perceived on the right. Spatial positioning is a what and where system, so where things are and what are they. Neural synchrony is the alignment plus processing / activation of neurons. Attention is where the action and reaction is set to take place. Okay? you have Gestalt psychologists and vision. So Gestalt psychologists were very interested in perception, all right? They believed that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. They also believed that objects are perceived in their simplest forms. Humans naturally follow lines and curves. The mind will attempt to fill in a detail that isn't actually there. Let's take a look at examples of use in Gestalt psychology. So upcoming, we're going to look at some definitions of that Gestalt psychologists came up with and examples of them. Examples of Gestalt psychology: continuation, closure, similarity, proximity. Okay? Continuation is when the eye is compelled to move through one object and continue to another object. We have an example of it on the bottom over here with all these red dots right next to each other. And you can just follow their patterns and just continue following it, and our eye is just compelled to follow the natural path of these objects. Closure is when an element is incomplete or a space is not totally enclosed, we subconsciously fill in the missing info. So on the diagram at the bottom, you see the circle that's incomplete and the star that's incomplete, but we know that it's a circle and a star because our mind fills in the missing information so that we can form the complete picture. Okay? Next, we have similarity, which occurs when one object looks similar to one another, if you will perceive them as a group and pattern. All right? So we have a pentagon here and an oval, and you can see you can either group them by shape or you can group them by color, and that's how similarity works. Proximity, it occurs when elements are close to each other. The position helps portray a relationship between the separate parts. So as you can see in this drawing right here at the bottom, you can't tell that there's a difference in the pictures below, like the circles and dots, because of how close they are to each other. However, in the one to the right, you can see that that they are distinct entities because there is a separation. All right. Next, we will be talking about recognition and visual input. So, recognition of visual input is a process that relies on the following. Okay? So, it relies on recognition of the visual input. It relies on the use of the feature net. It relies on the extensions of the feature net. It relies on top-down and bottom-up processing. And it relies on perceptual and sensational consistency. And we will go over what these mean. All right? Recognition of visual input. Recognition is how easily people recognize a pattern. This depends on whether the pattern is well formed and how long we are exposed to the pattern and stimulus. Recognition is significantly influenced by context, which can determine how or whether we even recognize an object. Okay? Many investigators have proposed recognition begins with the identification of features in the input pattern, followed by visual search tasks. Okay? This shows that searches for a target is defined by a single feature, and it is easy and extremely fast. Recognition relies on a feature net. Okay? So we will be talking about the feature net next. The feature net is a network of detectors, each of which is primed according to how often or how recently it has been fired or exposed to that stimulus. Okay, so it helps with identification by connecting the patterns together. Okay, this process relies on distributed knowledge to make inferences. During this process, some accuracy is compromised to gain efficiency. So again, it detects things fast and quickly, but as a result of that speed, sometimes accuracy is impaired. Okay. The feature net can be extended to other domains, including the recognition of 3D objects. Next, we will be talking about top-down and bottom-up processing. Bottom-up processing is the process of using little pieces of known information from the stimulus/environment to understand the whole, which means that you have no preconceived ideas and is completely data-driven. Right? Again, you're getting little pieces of data from the environment to connect the whole picture together. Okay, So, sensation is the bottom up process by which our senses, vision, hearing, smell, touch, and taste, are received and then relay external stimuli. An example of bottom up processing is stubbing your toe on a chair. The pain receptors detect pain and send this information to the brain where it is processed. Okay? Next, we will be talking about top down processing. Top down processing is object recognition and not in a self contained process. Instead, knowledge is external to object. Recognition is important and clearly shapes the process. When are you thinking about influences and how we see / understand and perceive the environment? Perception is a top-down mechanism that our brains use to organize and interpret data which we put into context. An example of this is seeing the chair that you stubbed your toe on before and you avoid it to make sure it doesn't happen again. Sensation. Sensational. Sensation in neurology and psychology is any concrete, conscious experience resulting from stimulation of a specific sense organ, sensory nerve, or sensory area in the brain. The word is used in a more general sense to indicate the whole class of such experiences. Okay? So, sensation happens when you eat noodles, or feel the wind on your face, or hear a car honking in the distance, or you're in the water and you feel the ocean waves, or the semester is over and you feel amazing that the semester is over, okay? So sensation. Perception refers to the way sensory information is organized, interpreted, and consciously experienced, and it involves both bottom-up and top-down processing. It is used in, How do we integrate both sensation and perception in our brain? The answer to this is called the binding problem, all right? Which means that information is thought of as one. We don't see things in pieces, we see them as wholes. Again, so you're taking the stimulus from the left side of the brain, which controls the right side of the brain, which controls the left side, and integrating it as one piece. This is how we interpret things, all right? Next, we have memory, okay? So memory, what is it and how does it function? Memory is the storage of previous experiences, all right? Memory first arrives as sensory memory by visual and auditory inputs. So from eyes and ears, all right, sensations, nerve activation, memory is associated with whatever sensory input, and then it forms memory. Memory then shifts to short-term memory, and then some information is transferred into long-term memory. We will take a look at the difference of both coming up, while also exploring the primary and recency effect, as well as how memory is measured. Okay? Memory is a three-part process that starts with acquisition, the acquiring of new information, and then storage, storing that new information, and then retrieval, which is using or recalling the information that has just been stored. All right? Perception and retrieval are intertwined. The newly acquired information is associated with information already stored and then retrieved. Working memory and long-term memory. So we're basically going to talk about one and then the other and their differences. All right? So working memory is considered a status of being. Something is constantly being thought about, actively being thought about, okay? It is considered an essential executive system, which means that it is being helped by lower level assistants, such as the articulatory rehearsal loop and the visuospatial buffer. We will talk about the articulatory rehearsal loop coming up. Working memory is also limited in size. Getting information into working memory is easy. Getting info out of working memory is also easy, and it is where your attention is focused, and that may shift quickly. All right? So now we'll talk about long-term memory. Long-term memory is considered the place that you hold all your knowledge and beliefs that you are not actively thinking about, okay? So think like memory bank. Long-term memory is enormous, big bank, big brain. Getting information into long-term memory often requires some work. So you need to put in the code. Certain codes activate the bank door to open up for you to be able to store that information. Getting information out of long-term memory may also be difficult or slow. secure bank. Not information is not easily accessible from there. Long-term memory is not linked to your current thoughts, so it is less fragile. Okay? Next, we have the components of working memory. Working memory is a system with several components. One of working memory's most important helpers is the articulatory rehearsal loop. The articulatory rehearsal loop is a subconscious rehearsal of information, and this helps you to maximize your efforts of recall. Elaborative rehearsal is needed. It is a process in which you see connections within the material to be remembered. Are connections between material to be remembered and things you already know. This process helps give things meaning. It gives the meaning. When you give something attention to meaning, this is called deep processing. When you give attention to something such as sound and visuals, it is considered shallow processing. So articulatory rehearsal loop helps you remember things, okay, by associating things with other things. All right. Next, we have primary and recency effect. So, primary and recency. What is it? How does it help us? How doesn't it help us? All right. So, we tend to pay more attention to the first and last of things. Recency. Recency means that we are able to hold on to the last few words in a sentence as no input follows them. So, last few words. Recency. Primacy is attention given to the first word and then is divided further as input arrives. So again, recency holds on to the last few words in a sentence as no input follows them. Recency, last few words. Primacy, attention is given to first word and then is divided further as input arrives. See what I did there? Operation span is a measure of working memory capacity. Ways to measure operation span. So psychologists have come up with this thing called the reading span, and it's used to measure the span researchers have participated in. Researchers have participants read sentences aloud and then have them recall the last word in each sentence. Okay? The participant is asked to read 1, 2, 3 continuing sentences. So when the participant is no longer able to recall that final word, this is known as their limit. So, okay, way to measure operation span. Theorists have come up with this thing called the reading span, in which they have participants read sentences over and over and then have them one at a time and then have them repeat the last word in each sentence. And then if they do good, if they're able to repeat that last word, they move on to another sentence. And then if they do good after that, another sentence, and then so on and so forth until they're no longer able to recall the final word. And once they do that, that's their limit. All right? So this limit helps define working memory's capacity. There's also chunking of data, which is the ability for working memory to hold 7 items and up to 9 items and no less than 5 items. All right? So next we'll be talking about how to improve working memory. So there is subvocalization, all right, which is the silent speech, okay? So subvocalization, silent speech. This in turn creates a phonological buffer, which is a room/compartment that creates an image of the info in the brain. So when you're trying to rehearse something or when you're trying to learn something new and you start talking to yourself about that information in a low tone, that helps your brain pay attention to it, to hold it in a certain compartment of your brain that makes it easily accessible to recall, okay? There is also the articulatory rehearsal loop that we mentioned before, which is also a form of subconsciously rehearsing information, except the difference between the two is that with articulatory rehearsal, you are forming associations with that information, whether that be a mnemonic device, whether that be an image, whether that be a smell, whether that be a sound, but you're forming an association with that new information given to help you access it, all right? Another thing that can help you improve working memory is exposure and repetition to stimulus, and when you decide to provide repetition to stimulus, okay? So ideally, you want to be in a state where you are calm, all right, where you are feeling good, okay, and when it's either the first thing that you do during the day or the last thing that you do in the day. So that's the primary and recency effect, all right? So the more you try to retain information, the more you will retain it, okay? That's why you should try to rehearse things in the morning upon waking and before sleep. Primary and recency, subvocalization, articulatory rehearsal, associating things with other things. So subvocalization, okay? This will not only create but solidify retrieval paths. Retrieval paths are creations of specific memory connections linking one memory to another, providing a path to that target memory, okay? And that is all for today, folks. Thank you so much for coming to my PowerPoint slide presentation, and I hope you all do well this semester. Thank you again.